Welcome to Revitalize and Replant with Mark Clifton, where we equip pastors to take their churches from declining to thriving by pointing them to a new future and a new hope. Join us weekly for encouragement and practical advice in your pastoring journey.
So, revitalize and replant. Sometimes those items, those terms are mutually exclusive.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It's interesting to me how some churches get so excited about wanting to revitalize.
Yes.
But they're not really into replanting. Or there are churches that are focused on replanting and they don't understand the revitalization aspect of it.
Yeah, some churches feel like they may need to be replanted, and we can talk about this in another podcast. But replanting is basically you just got to reboot the whole thing. I mean, there's not enough time. You don't have enough runway to revitalize. You're going to run out of time, so you got to replant. But some churches say we want to revitalize because they don't want to do the hard work of replanting.
Oh, that's a good point.
You know, but yeah.
This is Revitalize and Replant with Mark Clifton.
That's right.
That would be Mark Clifton.
I'm right here.
I'm Dan Hurst. We have no Mark Halleck.
We have no Mark Halleck.
Which in one way, we can talk about him now.
We could. He's not with us. I mean, he's with us. I mean, he hasn't died, but he's no longer with. He'll be with us again in a couple of days. We're Dan and I have gotten together and we're doing some podcast here, just he and I. Mark's in Denver, and he couldn't make it over here. So here's the deal: since these next 3 podcasts don't have Mark Halleck, we're only going to charge you half of what we normally charge you to listen. Yeah. So the subscription has decreased to half.
Which I'll be honest with you, is affecting us because of the tariffs.
That's true.
We have to charge 25% more just automatically.
That's right.
So
that's right. The tariff, because he comes from Denver, and so anything from out of state, we have to charge.
Exactly.
We should really quit this right now.
All right. Let's talk about something that, in fact, before we started this particular podcast, we were talking about back in the 80s.
Yes.
When you and I were in church planting.
Yes.
It was a little different then.
We planted a church together, by the way. We planted a couple of churches together. Yeah, at least. And they both
died. 3.
I think they all died. But
They didn't die.
No, they didn't die. They moved on. Castleview is still there. It's now called Living Stones.
Well, Liberty Community is now.
It's still there.
It's a different denomination.
That's right, but it's still there. So they're still there. But we started Castleview out in Blue Springs, Independence area. Dan and I, and I was doing this great study. You know, here I'm like 22, 23 years old. You know, and I'm the lead pastor, and I'm doing this great study on other denominations or occults. It was on cults. That's what it was. We were going to do a Sunday night study on cults. And so we were going to do Jehovah's Witness. So I asked you, as my trusty co-pastor, I said, would you maybe go find a JW magazine, the Watchtower, and we could pass those Watchtowers out and people could see. He said, I'll do that. So you went down to the truck stop down in Blue Springs, and they had a huge rack, like a spinning rack, a big tall rack, full of all kinds of JW, Jehovah's Witness material, you know. And I figured you just go take a few pieces. I come to church that Sunday morning, and you have that huge rack sitting in our vestibule. You just went in and took the whole thing out of the truck stop.
Nobody asked me any questions.
Anyway, I see it's still in your house here. Yeah, you keep it.
We keep potato chips in it.
All right, whatever. So we're talking, this is an article that I found. And the reason I like this article is because it mentioned Lyle Schaller. And most of you who are under the age of 60, you don't know who Lyle Schaller is. But he was a great church consultant. He wrote 55 books. Wow. He wrote one book 55 times, but well, kind of. And he was a great guy. And he was an old Methodist church consultant back in the day, and really pioneered a lot of what we see in church revitalization. And a lot of what I see in revitalization today can really go back to Lyle Schaller. And he had a huge influence on my life, for sure. By the way, I think Tom Rayner, he and I used to do this podcast together until I outgrew him. And anyway, but I think Tom has all 55 of Lyle Schaller's books, which I really did envy that. I only have a handful of them left, but I would like to have all of them. If anybody wants to give me all 55 of Lyle Schaller books. Anyway, but Lyle, he was 60s, 70s, 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. One of the things I always say when I'm doing my presentations around the globe, Lyle Schaller, even back in the 1970s, he could look forward and he said, if the church in North America dies, It won't die with a sword in its hand. It'll die in a velvet coffin. And I've never forgotten that. And he's very, very, very profound when he said that. So here are some reasons. This article is in Biblical Leadership. It's by Jim Farrer. And he talks about some reasons why it's harder today than in Lyle Shaller's day. Why church revitalization is harder today than when Lyle Shaller was writing and doing things in the 60s and 70s and even 80s. And when you and I were really, back when we had all of our faculties, and we I was late getting over here today because I thought, well, I'm going to get over to Dan's house about 1 o'clock. And so about 10:30, after a busy morning of ministry work, I sat down to rest for a minute. And I went sound asleep.
You needed it.
I slept in the daytime. That's what old men do.
Yeah, but with a schedule you keep.
Oh, well, that makes you feel better. Anyway.
Okay, so this first point is really fascinating because it's really convicting. Because it basically talks about the attitude of the church about what we're supposed to do now as opposed to maybe 20, 30 years ago.
Yep. What's he say?
Oh,
oh, you want me to talk about it?
He just says this: 93+% of typical church work is directed towards maintaining itself.
Yes. And that is so true. In the work that I see and the guys that I talk to, most churches just surviving, just maintaining what's going on, just keeping things going is their primary emphasis, rather than how do we reach lost people? How do we impact our culture? How do we give ourselves away? I mean, if we're going to die, wouldn't it be better to die giving your last dollar away than holding on to that last nickel, until somebody comes and takes it out of your dead hand? I mean, the vast majority of churches today are simply in a maintaining mode. They've sort of circled the wagons and they're afraid of the world, and they see, all the time I deal with dying churches. Their attendance is down, and their giving is down, and their baptisms are down, but they got some money, right? The most dying churches have a little bit of money put away, and they're scared to spend it.
Yeah.
When actually, that's what they ought to do. They ought to be generous with it. I mean, the Lord's not going to give them anything else if they are good stewards of what they have. But they're so focused on maintaining, and so many times, back after the Second World War, when denominations like ours and other mainline denominations were expanding all across the United States as the population shifted from, rural to urban. Man, churches were all about expansion and growth and reaching people. And then now it's all about just contracting and holding on to what we've got.
Well, and that you make a point here, too, about our finances. Look where we're spending our finances. It's in maintenance.
Yeah.
It's in upgrading, upkeep, that sort of thing. We're not really... We've lost that first love in many senses.
Right. And he says, the author says, in mainline denominations, and that includes all the declining denominations. And by the way, ours is more or less declining too. We've had some upticks in baptisms lately, and we're grateful for that. But in Southern Baptist life, membership continues to decline and attendance continues to decline. But he says in mainline denominations, 93% of a church's typical work is focused on itself, not on its community.
Along with that, and this is the second point that he makes, and that is that more than 80% of almost any denomination's growth is coming from congregations planted within the last 15 years.
That is spot on true with Southern Baptist. Spot on true. By 2030, it's going to be unbelievable what the percentage of growth is only in churches less than 20 years of age. In other words, among Southern Baptists, if we weren't planting 800 to 1,000 churches a year, we would be in a death spiral. All right. So all of the major baptism growth and attendance growth and breaking through cultural barriers growth has come in church planting in the last 10 or 20 years. And it's a good thing that we do that. I mean, the North American Mission Board that puts on this podcast, they are doing a tremendous job of not only planting churches, but planting churches that actually sustain over decades. Okay, this is really an important thing here, and it may be somewhat controversial. So,
not you.
No, I know. I try not to be controversial anymore. I wake up every day and try not to be controversial.
Well, you fail.
But when I was working at the Home Mission Board, which is the precursor to the North American Mission Board, we had something called Start Something New. And we actually had coffee mugs made up with the theme Start Something New on it, and T-shirts Start Something New. So it was from the Holy Spirit when you have swag with it. And the idea was trying to get in the 70s or 80s rather, 80s and 90s, trying to get churches just to start something new. All right. Go to an apartment complex, start a Bible study. Go to a mobile home park, start a Bible study. Go to a new subdivision, start a backyard Bible club. Could we just get you to start something new? It's a very good intention just to get them to look beyond themselves. And so we began to count the new things, and we felt like, well, if a church would start 15 new things, maybe 4 or 5 would stick. It was sort of the law of large numbers. The more we put out there, the more things might stick. And so we would count Bible studies and small groups and everything. We'd be excited for all the new things that were started, and that was good. But now in this current time that we're in, the North American Mission Board says, it's not just about how many things you start. It's about how well you start them, how planned they are, and what's their lifetime. And so now the emphasis isn't just on starting lots of things. It's starting strategic things that are going to be able to last. And so the life expectancy of church plants today far exceeds the life expectancy of church plants when you and I were planting in the 1980s. Far exceeds it. And so the reality is that among churches today, the vast majority of growth is among churches planted in the last 10 or 15 years. And you take those churches out, and we are in deep, deep trouble.
During that time that you're talking about, I started a pilot program. This was back before the term life church and life groups that had really taken off. And when I was serving in Florida, we had started basically a research program called Life Groups. The purpose of life groups back then was to go into homogenous communities that we couldn't reach as a church because they were gated communities,
sure,
as most of them are in the areas where we were working in Florida. So the idea was to go into a homogenous group and start some sort of a Bible study, and we were calling them life groups back then. I moved up here, took this, started working in ministries up here with churches at risk, is what we called them back then.
Sure.
And started this pilot program called a life church, which was, back a long, long time ago. And we started in this community where I'm living right now. Okay. And we said, what can we do in this community that is basically a homogenous group? It isn't really being reached by any significant concerns by any church for that matter. So we started the group. We were meeting in the clubhouse, and we were growing by leaps and bounds with young people. Okay. We weren't reaching that many adults. Right. We were getting a lot of teenagers. Right. And Luther Dyer. Yeah. From, Luther Dyer was an acquaintance. Yeah. And I was talking to Luther about it one day, and I said, what's going on here? He says, you started off with the intent to fail. And I said, what? Yeah. He said, you decided that you were going to reach whoever you could reach. And I said, well, we just wanted to see who we could reach. Right. He said, well, you found out, didn't you? Yeah. He said, why can't any other church do that? Right. He said, you're doing something that every other church could be doing as part of their ministry. All you've got is a small part of a ministry, which basically told me that a lot of the church replants or revitalizations are focused on the easy fruit. Yes. Yeah, I would agree. And I think one of the things we're looking at now in our church planting is we don't just go in and try to pick the easy fruit. Because here's what it is. And guys, listen to this. This is really important. We talk about church planting now. We don't talk about going in and starting a worship service or starting a group for people who are interested in something new necessarily. We talk about going in and sharing the gospel in a city and reaching a lost community and seeing them be made into disciples. And from that, we start the church. And you make such a big point on this about what's the footprint of your church. Exactly. Because back in the 80s and 90s, when we planted churches, we sort of just said, hey, we want something cool, something different than your mom and dad went to, because baby boomers were always about wanting something different than their parents went to.
to. So you and I would create a church experience very different than what they had, right? And the baby boomers always wanted to group and come together. So whether you're talking Willow Creek or Saddleback, but those 80s when we started all these churches like that. But today, the good thing about denominations like ours that are starting churches is they're really trying to start them with evangelism and going in and working in lost communities and seeing people come to know Christ and then discipling them, and then from that establish a church. And we see that much stronger and has a much longer lifespan and a much healthier start. So all of that to say, the good news is that among denominations like ours, church planting is really carrying all the weight for church growth and evangelism and discipleship. But the bad news is, for the majority of our churches that are older than 20 years, they are in serious decline.
Well, this brings us to the next point that Lyle Chandler made, and that is that today it seems like that most churches are looking for pastors who will take care of me and listen to and try to meet my needs when I call.
Exactly. When churches are looking to buy a pastor, and some of them do buy a pastor, actually. That was a Floridian slip. When churches are looking to hire a pastor, I think the vast majority, they'll say we like to have a pastor that would lead us to grow. But what they also want to make sure is we have a pastor who cares for us and maintains us and takes care of us.
On the outside, that looks okay.
It does.
But then when you weigh it in the balance, all of a sudden it's not balanced.
Right, because oftentimes if the church is in decline and it's not impacting its neighborhood and it's not fulfilling its great commission, the pastor has to, on the one hand, he has to love and care for the flock. On the other hand, he has to challenge the flock to move beyond who they are and what they're doing, and that challenging is uncomfortable. And we don't want a pastor who makes us uncomfortable. That's why year 2 and 3 is when so many pastors tap out, because the church says we want to change, we want to reach young people, we want to grow, and so they call him, and he loves on them, and they love him, and for the first year or two, everything's great. But then when he actually begins to lead them to do these things, they go, whoa, wait a minute, this change is too painful, and they begin to push back. So, I think many times churches are, one of the good things about this podcast is I had a guy the other day from a really large church, a really mega church, layman, said, we're looking for a pastor. He said, we've been sharing this podcast with our pastor search team because it helps them understand what they should look for in a pastor. So hopefully that will be helpful. But I think looking at what this article says, man, so many churches, they just want a pastor who takes care of them. They want a chaplain rather than someone who really challenged them to be a missionary in the neighborhood. They want a chaplain, someone who'll be there for hospital visitations and who'll lead little Bible studies. I shouldn't say it that way, but a chaplain, someone who sort of cares for your own needs, as opposed to maybe a missionary who'll lead us to charge up against the culture as we have it. And listen, I love chaplains. Military chaplains are my favorite people in the world. So I'm not suggesting you don't do ministry, but I'm talking about in terms of, are you a chaplain to that group? They hire you to do their spiritual work, but not to challenge them beyond their comfort zone.
Mm-hmm. You used the word just a while ago, painful. And it kind of it reminded me of something that we talk about a lot on this podcast, and that is that church growth, and I hate to use that term because it alludes back to a style rather than a commitment. But when we start revitalizing or renewing or replanting churches, it's painful. It's a painful process because the world isn't ready for it. The world doesn't want it.
Right. And
if the world is snuck into the church,
right,
then the church doesn't want it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And, something that Lyle talks about is this idea that that church is often on the wrong side of history because we listen to what the media says and what the world has to say, and the world is saying that we don't fit anymore.
Right.
Or that we're irrelevant.
Right. And whenever the church tries to become relevant, it just looks cheesy, and it becomes even more irrelevant.
Which, by the way, is a nod to Mark Halleck.
Yeah. Mark always talks about when you try to look cool and hip and relevant, you just come off looking cheesy.
Yeah.
And, Martin Lloyd-Jones used to always say that the more the church tries to look like the culture, the less the church has anything to say to the culture.
Yes.
And so, I think absolutely absolutely. And our sort of desire to say, hey, we're going to try to be relevant, then we're going to sort of try to adapt to the culture and make the culture like us and us like the culture, that never works. And you see that in a lot of mainline denominations, that once they said, okay, all bets are off, we're gonna accept everything now, we're going to be all inclusive, and then they just curl up and die. It's like, well, I thought you were all inclusive. How come everybody's not coming to you? Because they've got nothing different to offer than the rest of the world. Right. That's why. And
you mentioned this even before we started the podcast about how remember when we were, what we were doing as opposed to now. And now we're seeing a culture that does want something different.
Yeah, exactly. What he says here in this article about things are different today is today young people, they want to be challenged greatly. Well, if you go, most dying and declining churches don't challenge anybody to do anything. It's not about challenging. It's about comfort. It's about familiarity. It's about ease. Well, that's not engaging to young folks. And so, when you have a church that's not out there, that's why church plants attract so many young people, because it's a challenge. It's a work. You got to bring in the stuff out of the truck, set it up every Sunday, unload it. Every week's a new adventure. Whereas if you're at a declining church, every week looks like it did in 1973. I mean, nothing changes. It's all the same. It's all about our comfort. It's all about our ease. That does not attract or motivate young people.
One of the things that I have found in my preaching is that most of the people who come up after a message to talk and want to not challenge but question something, what did you mean by this? Or I was thinking when you said this, most of them are under the age of 40.
Sure.
It's interesting because over the age of 40, is that saying that we've already made up our mind?
Yep.
Or it's not an issue for us, whatever the case may be. But under the age of 40, I'm finding that they want to be challenged, and I say this all the time. I don't care if you disagree with me. I'm fine with somebody disagreeing with me, but you better back it up with Scripture.
Yeah.
And that is a challenge to them, and it's so fun to watch them come. Well, the Bible says.
Yeah.
Quotes. I love that.
Sure.
Because it says that they are looking for a challenge, and they're looking for something that questions.
So I wish Lyle Schaller were here. I'd love to talk with him, and I'd say, Lyle, this is why it's so much more difficult today than even it was difficult in the 60s and 70s and 80s. It's never been easy, but it's so much more challenging today. And as the author of this article points out, one of the primary reasons is that, frankly, we're not growing by evangelical growth. I mean, he says less than 3% of mainline churches are growing by evangelical growth. So we're not penetrating lostness, all right, at all. And then he also says, as we talked about, that most churches are focused on maintaining themselves. 93% of their effort and their money goes to just maintaining themselves. And then he says, also most churches hire pastors to try to care for their needs and meet their own needs. And most churches don't challenge young people to anything unique or challenging. It's all about maintenance. And none of that is attractive to young folks. And none of that's a lifestyle that will continue the church to grow. It's really a lifestyle of a slow death, but it's always a lifestyle toward death.
All right, so I want to come back. Can we talk about this in the next podcast and kind of follow up on something that Schaller said here?
Sure.
Because I want to give you this word.
What?
And you folks can think about this for a week now.
Oh, a whole week.
For our next podcast.
All right.
And that is the word, is your church full of agnostics?
Oh, yeah, because it's a good word, yeah. Agnostics. Not agnostics, but agnostics. Yeah.
And we'll talk about that next week.
However, I do want to say it is harder today. It is, for those reasons we just said. But the gospel's greater than all of that. And, man, we see all the times churches turning around and Jesus showing up and giving them a plan for their church, and so there is always hope. I don't want you to leave this thinking there isn't. But I do think, looking at the landscape among mainline denominations and Southern Baptists included, it's a challenge right now. Mm-hmm. So many churches are in decline, and so many of you who are listening to this podcast, we've just described your church, a church that focuses on maintaining, a church that wants the membership to be well taken care of, a church that doesn't challenge young people, all of those things. And how do we break through that? So we'll hopefully talk about that in the next podcast a little bit more. But don't quit. Jesus has a plan for your church, and trust me, the gospel's greater than any obstacle you might encounter.
And we would recommend also that you share this podcast with your people.
Yeah.
Help them see this perspective from an outsider of your church.
Right.
We're not in your church.
Right.
But yet, we're talking about things that may be happening in your church, and it may help them to just kind of focus in and maybe shed some light on circumstances and patterns.
And if you see these trends in your church, they are not a trend of health, and they're not going to lead you where you want to go.
This is Revitalize and Replant with Mark Clifton, and thank you so much for spending time with us, and thank you to the North American Mission Board for making it possible for us to do these on a weekly basis, and especially thank you for being part of our family. See you next week.
Thanks for joining us today on Revitalize and Replant. This podcast is brought to you by the North American Mission Board, where we help dying or struggling churches regain health for the glory of God and the good of their communities. If you found this conversation helpful, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform. To learn more about becoming a replanting pastor or to explore resources about revitalization for your own church, visit churchreplanters.com.